All right. Welcome to the Grayzone. It's another Friday over here at the Grayzone. The Buzzsaw is back. Award-winning Canadian journalist who's gone across state lines and cross borders to be with us today, Aaron Maté. And I'm here and we're now live on Rockfin as well. As always, lots of insanity to discuss. Aaron, it looks like you're in a kind of warm, almost subtropical location,
aka Jimmy Dore's house.
Nice. Yeah, I recognize that.
Yeah. You stayed here before. Yeah, I'm guest hosting for Jimmy starting today, so I'll be doing that shortly after we wrap the stream. And you mentioned, as always, Max, we're here on Friday, and as always, we're late. This week we're 15 minutes late. So
no, I wanted to dispute that actually. See, no one says Jimmy's late because he has like a countdown and he has like the salsa merengue, and we just don't have that, but we're going to get that eventually. It really just takes the will on my part. It's like a presidential assassin. All it takes is the will. And I just haven't had the will because I'm just busy with a million other things. One thing I've been busy with today is packing because we're heading to Nashville. We have another, and we're going to be where Jimmy Dore is now that you're filling in. And I'm going to be doing some sets with him at Zany's in Nashville on Sunday. And I thought I would check out the city there. It's kind of crazy how expensive Nashville's gotten. I went there like 20 years ago. It was totally different. But it looks like everyone from California flocked there. And there must be like loads of crypto bros there because, I mean, just getting lodging there was out of control. But I'm looking forward to seeing Jimmy and whoever shows up. There's 2 shows because the first one sold out.
Yeah, 4 p.m. show in Nashville. There's still tickets.
Right.
So this is your chance to see Max. And I've seen Max now perform stand-up several times. I'm telling you, he kills. It's not fair that someone who is such a good journalist is also such a good stand-up comedian. And I say that as someone who's tried stand-up before and failed miserably. So if you're in Nashville, this is your chance.
Yeah, I think my true persona comes out. This is me kind of attempting to seem serious. And I mean, I'm glad I never pursued a career in comedy because by this point I'd be like the stereotypical sad clown.
Oh, yeah.
I'd just be a complete miserable wreck. And I'd have done all these open mics where I would have bombed. And also my comedy would just completely fall flat in front of a blue-pilled normie audience that was like peppered with, you know, Maddow watchers. It would just... it would be horrible. It only works because it's in front of Jimmy Dore's audience.
It's true. Your comedy spirit would have been crushed during the Russiagate era, especially. It would have.
Before then, I'm sure. During the Obama era, I mean, you couldn't mock Obama.
That's true.
Remember, it took like Saturday Night Live years to find an Obama. Like they finally got an Obama impersonator. Like it was so hard to do because he was the Messiah.
Yeah.
The drone Messiah. Well, speaking of, I mean, we're talking about Obama. I remember during the Obama campaign, Jesse Jackson went on Fox News and he was on a hot mic and he's like, I want to rip his nuts off. And the subtext wasn't quite clear, but Jesse Jackson had kind of come up in the struggle and he was upset with Obama constantly wagging his finger at Black politicians and Black people in general. And he said under his breath, he's always talking bad about Black people. I'm sick of, and you know, he was right. Obama never delivered. What did he deliver for Black people? The lowest home ownership rate in over 50 years, massive precipitous decline in real wages, and lectures, you know, telling Pokey, you got to pull your pants up and stop watching Sports Center. And so we have another situation on our hand now that really clarifies what a bunch of complete sellouts the Black Congressional Caucus and the Black political establishment is, as a Black radical group has been indicted by the FBI on what look like transparently trumped up charges targeting their speech, Aaron. And I don't know if you want to introduce this segment, but you've been following this really closely. The indictment by the FBI of the African Peoples Socialist Party in St. Petersburg, Florida.
Right. So back in July, there was this raid in 2 states, in Florida and Missouri, of members of the African Peoples Socialist Party. And this raid came in conjunction with an indictment of a Russian national for allegedly acting to sow discord in the U.S., the typical Russiagate playbook charges. And the African Peoples Socialist Party, their members were raided in these 2 states because they were basically named in the indictment as unindicted co-conspirators. An alleged Russian agent seeking to basically spread Kremlin propaganda in the U.S. And these members of the African Peoples Socialist Party were named in that indictment. Well, now, just this week, those members of that party, 4 members, 3 of them are current members, 1 of them is a former member, were indicted. And here's the announcement from the Justice Department. U.S. citizens and Russian intelligence officers charged with conspiring to use U.S. citizens as illegal agents of the Russian government. Defendants sought to sow discord, spread pro-Russia propaganda, and interfere in elections within the United States. So first of all, look at what the Justice Department says they did here. Sow discord and spread pro-Russia propaganda. Putting aside whether they actually did that or not, is that now illegal to, quote, sow discord and spread pro-Russia propaganda?
And how can an American interfere in an American election?
Exactly. And what's actually being done here is the Justice Department is using the Russiagate playbook, which is to basically smear anybody who dissents from the national security state as a Russian agent, to go after black radicals. And if you read the indictment, they accuse them of not filling out a form as agents of the Russian government. That's the actual charge. But the content of the indictment is basically goes after the content of their speech. It mentions how they criticize the proxy war in Ukraine, how they point out that Nazis are incorporated into Ukraine's armed forces and we are funding those armed forces. It basically goes after the content of their speech. And what it says when it comes to an actual criminal offense is that they acted as agents of the Russian government without filling out a form to do that, when really all they have in the way of evidence is that these defendants interacted with some Russians and they received a pretty small amount of money for some of their activities.
It's like several $100s, right?
Yeah, and basically, but what they're doing though is basically sharing opinions that they've been sharing for their entire political lives. And one of the defendants is Amalia Shatella, who's like in his 80s. He's been an activist for decades, and he's been saying this. He's been criticizing the U.S. government forever, but now what the government is basically saying that he's doing this at the behest of the Kremlin, and this is the result, the direct outgrowth of Russiagate, in which the national security state decided that basically whoever was not conducive to its interests, whoever was calling for diplomacy with Russia, whoever was challenging the imperatives of the CIA, that they were a Russian agent. And this is being dusted off to go after now these black activists.
Yeah, and it's pretty clear that after Russiagate, the whole hysteria had been stirred up. There was pressure at the DOJ to do indictments to back up what we've been constantly hearing from Maddow, mostly from the blue wing of the corporate media, but also from Adam Schiff, the Senate and House Democrats, which is that there were actual Russian agents of influence inside the U.S. who were interfering and sowing discord. And constantly we heard that Black Lives Matter had been influenced by Russian bots, by the fraudmeister Clint Watts, who we'll talk about later, who's exposed as just a complete huckster at the head of this Hamilton 68 bot tracker. We constantly heard that. And so it's kind of baked into the liberal cake at the base of the Democratic Party that these cells exist, very much like, very reminiscent of the way that the Republican base believed that terror cells were everywhere. And they had been essentially told that by the president. And there was pressure on the John Ashcroft Justice Department, John Ashcroft applying the pressure himself to nab some Muslim leadership in the US, put them on trial in high profile trials, and prove that they were taking down the network of terror inside the US. So that's what I think. This is a political case, but there's also pressure locally from the St. Petersburg Democrats. I think this is my theory. They've definitely come out and supported this indictment to get rid of these troublemakers who are in their midst, who are constantly running in elections and mobilizing a small slice of the local Black population for an independent party that is not part of the Democratic Party. And we know how the Democrats feel about independent candidates, from Ralph Nader to Jill Stein. They want to destroy them by any means.
And let's take the charges at face value just for a second. Okay, so these black leftists are accused of taking, hundreds, maybe thousands of dollars from some Russians for political activities. When foreign governments like, Belarus or Russia or whoever else, charge people in their country with acting as agents of the U.S., the U.S. always cries foul and claims that this is, a crackdown on freedom. And the difference is that when the U.S. does it, they spend not hundreds or thousands of dollars, they spend tens of millions of dollars on trying to sow discord abroad and trying to, use people for U.S. political goals. I mean, Victoria Nuland in Ukraine alone, she bragged that the U.S. spent billions of dollars on promoting pro-Western forces, which were then deployed for the 2014 coup. That's actual malign influence and sowing discord, because it leads to things like a coup in Ukraine. Here we're talking about some random activists, getting money for, in this case, apparently some Russians gave them money for a speaking tour to say things they've always been saying. And now the U.S. is charging people for what it condemns other governments of doing. So the difference is other governments, in the case of foreign countries, the U.S. spends tens of millions and in some cases billions of dollars on those activities.
Yeah, April 18th, 2018, almost just a few days ago, was the anniversary of April 18th, 2018, when gangs of hooligans took over large swaths of Nicaragua and laid siege to the country's economy and people, left hundreds dead in order to overthrow the elected Sandinista government, targeted Sandinistas across the country. This is something I covered, interviewed victims of the violence. This was spawned by the U.S. through meddling in Nicaraguan politics, civil society, media, by laying the groundwork for insurrection, in the words of a publication funded by the National Endowment for Democracy, the regime change arm of the U.S. government, which spawns coups, color revolutions, and topples leaders the U.S. doesn't like through elections all over the world. This was a violent attempt to use illegal, and some would say terrorist, activity to overthrow the government of Daniel Ortega outside of democratic confines. And it was funded by the National Endowment for Democracy. This is a report I did just 2 months into the what you could call a rebellion, but was really textbook insurrection. And I wrote about how Nicaraguan student protest leaders, you can see them here with like Marco Rubio and Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, the former congresswoman from Florida. They met with neocons in DC, and a publication funded by the NED boasts of spending millions of dollars laying the groundwork for insurrection. And here we have, the receipts. This is on the new NED's website. I mean, these are hundreds of thousands of dollars to Global Americans. That's the publication. Then we have, there's Ted Cruz meeting with the students. These students were brought up by Freedom House, which is another group funded by the U.S. government, funded by the U.S. taxpayer. Then here's more forms to IEEPP, which is one of the major groups at the forefront of this violent insurrection in Nicaragua. $60,000, $55,000 from the NED. And then we had money from the USAID. This happens in countries around the world. And then the US goes and indicts people for getting a few $100 from Russia, and then deploying what they call propaganda, which is a completely neutral term, and is basically prosecuting them for their speech, connecting them going on a conference in Russia to things they said. So the point is, the US spends millions and millions more than Russia did on this organization that the FBI is indicting. And the US does so not just to interfere in elections, but to actually carry out insurrections that make January 6th look like a Shriners parade.
And of course, like, what is this charge? It's going back to the McCarthy era, going back to the time when Dr. King was smeared as a Soviet agent. This is the classic playbook. And where are liberals on this? Liberals have branded themselves, especially since 2020, when they use this to help get Biden elected, as being for Black Lives Matter. I mean, supporting the George Floyd protests, using that as a get out the vote operation for Democrats. So where are they now when black activists are being smeared as Russian agents and being indicted for their speech. If you look at MSNBC, I've seen no coverage of this indictment at all, which is especially amazing given that when anybody gets, charged or suspected of having anything to do with Russia, places like MSNBC are all over it. Like if there's any Russian agent related news, like the case of Maria Butina, for example, that Russian lady who was imprisoned for a long time because she allegedly failed to register as a Russian agent while going to Republican events. They were all over that case. She was smeared as a spy. In this case, there's nothing. And why is that? Because they know that they face a problem. So they promoted this Russiagate mania for 6 years, but they also know that they've branded themselves as being pro Black Lives Matter. But now you have a contradiction because your allies, their allies have been throughout this, the FBI and the CIA. Well, now the FBI is using Russiagate to go after black activists. So the response, they can't condemn it because that would go after their traditional allies in the FBI. And also it would expose the real uses, the real goals of Russiagate, which is to smear genuine dissent to the national security state. So their only response is silence.
Yeah. Silence from not just the people who are depicted here, Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, and Kente Cloth, but silence from the groups that declared a rebellion for racial justice to destroy the virus of racism in the U.S. And we're talking about Black Lives Matter, the organization itself. I don't think they've said anything about this. What happened with Black Lives Matter after their brand really took off and they got out in the streets and got waves of Americans out in the street? Well, here's what happened. $220 million from the Open Society Foundations, which is the foundations of anti-communist billionaire George Soros, who is hell-bent on regime change in Russia and is the top funder of the Democratic Party. So basically co-optation, complete co-optation of the major activists involved in BLM, including the figures like Alicia Garza, who've gone on high-paid lecture tours, who've just soaking in foundation money. They created that brand, and basically what they did was they co-opted themselves. They opened up they paved the way for the co-optation of a rebellion that started in places like Ferguson, outside St. Louis, and in Baltimore, and that didn't have a brand at that time. And they brought it back into the ranks of the Democratic Party. They brought Black civil society back into the confines of the Democratic Party. And then they wound up, the leaders of Black Lives Matter, these three women who founded it, they wound up endorsing Elizabeth Warren over Bernie Sanders. Here's the traditional CIA cutout known as the Ford Foundation. Well, it used to be a pass-through for the CIA. I don't know what it does now. $180 million for U.S. racial justice efforts. Look at the date on this, October 9th, 2020. So basically, BLM had begun to die down because the election was coming up, and if Biden was going to be elected, then there would be no need for this movement any longer, which had already been corralled by the Democrats. So they're basically paying them to go home, to go away, go into little NGOs and do cultural critiques and go into universities and just stay out of the streets. That's what this is about. And so we can see that one of the few groups that's left in the streets that's actually out there that's condemning U.S. empire, where do they get? What do they get? They get a militarized raid on the home of their leader.
And an indictment threatening them with years in prison. And remember, during George Floyd, you even had senior officials from the Obama administration and now the Biden administration, like Susan Rice, getting out there to use the protest to fearmonger about Russia and also basically send a tacit threat to the protest to keep them in line, to keep them within acceptable bounds, to denounce so-called extremism on both sides, basically painting an equivalence between so-called extremists even inside the Black Lives Matter movement. So this is Susan Rice using the Russiagate boogeyman during the George Floyd protests.
And they are probably also, I would bet, based on my experience, I'm not reading the intelligence today or these days, but based on my experience, this is right out of the Russian playbook as well. But we can't allow the extremists the foreign actors to distract from the real problems we have in this country that are long-standing, centuries old, and need to be addressed responsibly by new leadership.
You're absolutely right on the foreign interference, because we know for decades the Russians, when it was the Soviet Union, the communists, they've oftentimes tried to embarrass the United States by promoting the racial divide in our country. But what you're suggesting, Ambassador, is that they're still trying to do that. Is that what you're saying?
Oh, we see it all the time. We've seen it for years and frankly every day on social media, where they take any divisive, painful issue, whether it's immigration, whether it's gay rights, whether it's gun violence, and always racism, and they play on both sides. Their aim is not simply to embarrass the United States, Wolf. Their aim is to divide us, to cause us to come into combat with each other, to disintegrate from within. And I would not be surprised to learn that they have fomented some of these extremists on both sides using social media. I wouldn't be surprised to learn that they're funding it in some way, shape, or form.
Well, that kind of reminds me, I'm trying to find the video clip, but I can't find it. But Kamala Harris actually blamed Russia for Kaepernick taking a knee. She was on the Breakfast Club. Can't find the video right now. But yeah, that was consistent with, not just Maddow, but the Black leadership that was brought into or around the Biden administration, blaming Russia for acts of Black civil resistance. It was happening at the highest level. So, yeah.
I got that Kamala clip. It's a classic.
Beautiful.
So that's what they start to do. Right. That's what they start to do. They did it then, they will do it now. People have said, if you look at, for example, the heat that ended up around the bend the knee and Colin Kaepernick.
Mm-hmm.
Many smart people have said it actually was not a thing. The Russian bots started taking that on.
Yeah. You feel like you're being targeted by Russian bots now?
Well, we already know we are.
Oh man, the heat. She could barely even articulate what she's trying to say, but she said that was not even a thing. In other words, there wasn't this protest that took over the NFL that eventually put so much pressure on the owners, including former anti-civil rights protester and Dallas Cowboys owner Jerry Jones, that he actually had to get on the field and take a knee, that it was Russian bots who somehow made that happen. And I know where she got that from Hamilton 68.
Yeah, of course. The whole thing, by the way, is on top of being just ridiculous, it's so fundamentally racist. It's so condescending toward Black people. The presumption underlying all of this is that Black people are so malleable that these malicious foreign powers can manipulate for their ends. So use them in the case of the African Peoples Socialist Party to spread pro-Kremlin propaganda, or in the case of Colin Kaepernick, that it's Russians that are behind that, not Colin Kaepernick and people who support him protesting real police violence, to the point where Hillary Clinton was also saying that Russian bots were able to convince people not to vote for her in 2016. This is what she said.
I mean, we're going to have a lot of problems. And the thing we have to do is get enough people to turn out so that they can't, steal those votes through suppression in Wisconsin, or convince Blacks not to vote in Michigan.
Convince Blacks not to vote.
This time, which was very effective, and the Russians played a big role in.
The Russians convinced Blacks not to vote. Yeah. She's just saying Black people are stupid dupes. It's like when Kamala Harris went on, I don't think it was the Breakfast Club, or some other urban radio station, and she was just talking down to Black people like they were stupid children and saying, Russia's a big country and Ukraine is a small country, and the big country attacked the small country, and that's why we have to defend the small country. Like, you clearly think that the base of the Democratic Party is stupid if you're talking to them that way, and specifically Black people. So yeah.
And Matt, going back to your original point, how you started the segment mentioning Jesse Jackson, who was running for president in the 1980s and, achieved some success, attracted a movement of people. You compare who the black candidates, the black politicians who the Democratic Party elevates now, and it's all people like this: Obama, Susan Rice, Kamala Harris, who all talk down to people, in a stark contrast to Jesse Jackson, who wanted to uplift black people and uplift actually all oppressed people. And that this is who now the party features. It's people like Kamala and Susan Rice and Obama who talk down and also parrot these insane propaganda campaigns designed to undermine actual black leftists and actual leftists in this country.
Well, let's hear from Omali Yeshitela. Look, I can't say that I'm speaking like with total affinity for this party or that I support everything they stand for, but they are an anti-imperialist party. And, you know, he actually, Omali Yeshitela's one of the party members appeared at the Rage Against the War Machine rally in February and spoke there. And Chairman Omali spoke at a rally a month later. And you know, I don't know if there's any, but he's speaking against the indictment.
Uhuru, as it has been said, my name is Omali Yeshitela. I'm chairman of the African Peoples Socialist Party and chairman of the Black is Back Coalition for Social Justice, Peace, and Reparations. On July 29th, at 5 o'clock in the morning, pre-dawn, an army of assault weapons toting, camouflage wearing, military forces identifying themselves as the FBI attacked my home. They used flashbang grenades, armored vehicles. They threatened my life and threatened my wife. They used drones. This was in St. Louis, Missouri, in the most economically depressed sector of that city. At the same time, on the white side of St. Louis, they attacked a movement, solidarity movement, and they used battering rams also there, knocked down doors. They held people hostage, handcuffed at gunpoint, as they did me and my wife, whom they handcuffed and zip-tied in front of our homes. They declared that despite the fact that I have been involved in fighting this system for most of the 81 years that I have been alive, despite the fact that I have opposed every predatory war that the United States, which, by the way, is the strategic enemy of all of humanity, despite the fact that I have always done that, that they have declared that black people are so stupid that it takes Russians to tell us that we are oppressed. I have never known a moment of black freedom for my entire life. I have never read of a moment since the beginning of a colonial mode of production where black people have been free. And yet they're saying that we are agents of some foreign power because we say black people must be free.
So, I mean, he's saying making two important statements there. One, Russia doesn't need to tell him to condemn U.S. empire because he sees himself as an African person, as a target of U.S. empire, a victim of U.S. empire. And two, his home was targeted in a militarized raid with literal robots, bomb robots, lasers, and a tactical SWAT team wearing full body armor, just invading his home with assault weapons out. This is an 80-year-old man. This is such overkill. It's so out of control. And so we are seeing the casualties of Russiagate in real time. And there's also something we should mention, which is that the African Peoples Socialist Party is not the only group indicted in this dragnet. There's also Black Hammer, which is a weird kind of cult-like group based in Atlanta, which I assume is heavily penetrated by law enforcement, federal law enforcement already, and kind of has a more off-kilter orientation. Some of the stuff I hear them say, I just have to think they might be like they're a few cards short of a deck, and they're exploiting a lot of alienation and anger and recruiting people who come from like, vulnerable backgrounds. And I mean, but that organization, Black Hammer, it's basically a joke. Like, there's no way that they can really influence U.S. politics, and it's unclear to me how they're wrapped up with Russia. But it just adds to the absurdity of this indictment that the FBI would even see this organization as a threat to anything other than, the mental well-being of its members. And there are plenty of cults out there. So,
well, we can move Mac to our next segment, and it fits in with the impact of Russiagate, because another major impact of Russiagate has been a crackdown on free speech and cementing even deeper ties between the national security state and our media and our tech giants. And the Twitter files, which Matt Taibbi has reported on, have underscored that, showing just major coordination between tech giants and the national security state and a bunch of front groups of the national security state. And if you remember back recently when Matt Taibbi testified before Congress, Stacey Plaskett, who is a non-voting member of Congress, she smeared Matt Taibbi and his fellow witness, Michael Schellenberger. Among many things, she called them a threat. So let's show that clip first, and then we're going to tell you the latest in this saga. But this is what Stacey Plaskett said to Matt Taibbi and Michael Schellenberger back when they testified just recently.
A threat to the people who oppose them, whatever that means.
Mr. Chairman, I'm not exaggerating when I say that you have called before you two witnesses who pose a direct threat to people who oppose them.
So that's Stacey Plaskett, member of Congress. Well, fast forward to now, to this week, and guess what Stacey Plaskett just did to Matt Taibbi? She threatened him with prison time. In a letter that she sent to him, she accused Matt Taibbi of making false statements when he appeared before Congress, and noted that the penalty for that is perjury. And what is the basis for her saying all this? Well, it's Mehdi Hasan, Mehdi Hasan, the MSNBC Peacock host who brought on Matt Taibbi and tried to find any factual errors in his reporting. It turns out that what Mehdi thought was an error in Matt's reporting, in one significant case, wasn't actually an error. But in the process, Mehdi accused Matt of lying to Congress, intentionally misleading Congress. And in Stacey Plaskett's letter to Matt Taibbi, she cites that interview with Mehdi Hasan as evidence that he misled Congress. And now she's threatening him with years in prison. So here is Li Fang, who revealed this. And Li Fang also, by the way, revealed that Mehdi got it wrong. And it's such a stupid issue because it totally distracts from the point, which is the substance of Matt's reporting, which nobody wants to discuss because they don't want to look at the fact that, social media has been weaponized and used to go after dissent. But basically, it has to do with an acronym between two different groups, CIS, the Center for Internet Secure or Information Security, and CISA, which is a government agency. And in one tweet, Matt basically mixed those up, CIS and CISA. But in Congress, he didn't. So Mehdi got it wrong, and in Congress, Matt mixed those up, which he didn't. And regardless, it's a distinction without a difference, because both of these groups, CISA, which is a government agency, and CIS, which is a nonprofit, both of them are government funded, and both of them have worked together to try to police the internet. So really, the distinction doesn't even matter. But even to the extent that it does, Mehdi got it wrong. So basically, in the letter, Stacey Plaskett cites Matt's comments before Congress and then uses Mehdi Hasan's claims about them to accuse him of lying.
Yeah. So basically, we have a sitting member of Congress who's a non-voting member of Congress. kind of a fake member of Congress, but she's decided that her participation in this weaponization of the federal government subcommittee is going to be her opportunity to make it into prime time as the pit bull attack dog for the Democrats, taking down all Jim Jordan's witnesses. And it's culminated. I don't even know if this is the culmination, with her calling for 5 years in prison for a journalist for simply getting an acronym wrong. It's kind of remarkable. And Mehdi Hasan has completely, I mean, the whole point of, we went through this before, the whole point was to create the sense among the Democratic base that Matt Taibbi had got up there and completely lied under oath, that everything he said was a lie. And so Stacey Plaskett is seizing on that to call for the imprisonment of a journalist, which is totally is ironic in the context of what Taibbi and Schellenberger's testimony was about, which is the state censoring social media in order to prevent the public from seeing dissident views. So this is just consistent with a government and an administration in particular that is afraid of people, afraid of the American people, and wants to suppress their impulses to rebel at a time of imperial decline.
And, you know, this is not just coming from Stacey Plaskett. In Lee Fong's latest article on this, and Lee Fong debunks the claims that Mehdi made about Matt Taibbi. And Mehdi responded to Lee Fong, by the way, not by challenging anything he reported, but by calling Lee an Islamophobe.
Oh, yeah, I remember
These
that.
are two former colleagues at The Intercept, and Mehdi's response to Lee's factual debunking of Mehdi's claims about Matt Taibbi is to call Lee an Islamophobe.
Well, he had previously called him an Islamophobe, and it was because Lee brought up that Mehdi had worked for Qatari media, and it might have been in the context of Mehdi doing some Russiagate business or something.
Well, what happened was Mehdi said something about Tulsi Gabbard and some sort of guilt by association, tying her to Modi. And Lee said, basically, by your standards, you'd be guilty of the same thing because you worked for, you draw a paycheck from a Gulf dictatorship. And he was saying, just as it wouldn't be fair to dismiss you, even though you draw a paycheck from a Gulf dictatorship, you're not being fair to Tulsi Gabbard. That was his point.
And then Mehdi was like, "Go! Why don't you put on your MAGA hat? Exactly. Oh, you Islamophobe! Yeah. Oh, how dare you?" Because there's nothing he could say.
So here is Lee Fong pointing out that this letter actually did not just come from Stacey, although it was signed by Stacey Plaskett. It did not just come from her. It was a group effort, so when Lee sent an inquiry to Plaskett's office, he got a response not from Plaskett, but by an advisor to House Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries. And the metadata on the letter that Stacey Plaskett sent to Matt Taibbi shows it was authored by Jackie Kapler, a lawyer with the House Judiciary Committee who works closely with former House Judiciary Committee Chair Jerry Nadler. So this is not just Stacey Plaskett. This is the people who work closely with Hakeem Jeffries and Jerry Nadler. So this is basically the House Democratic leadership calling for the imprisonment of a journalist.
Yeah. And I don't know, has Matt responded in any way?
Matt responded. I think he just called on Mehdi to retract his false claims. And last time I checked, it's hard for me to do it because I'm blocked by Mehdi. But last time I checked, Mehdi had not said a word about this. So basically, his false claims are being used to call for the jailing of a journalist. And now, after being so braggadocious, claiming falsely that he had debunked Matt Taibbi's reporting, when in reality he had caught a couple of errors and also falsely claimed that some were errors, Mehdi's gone completely silent on this. So nothing to say about his false claims being used to call for the imprisonment of a journalist.
Well, last week we talked about the U.S.-funded intel by proxy outfit Bellingcat or Bellingcop helping to catch a leaker, the Pentagon leaker, before the FBI could. And now we see another, I wouldn't even call Mehdi Hasan a journalist because he's never done journalism. He's just sort of a broadcast personality, setting the stage for a U.S. official to at least call for or threaten a journalist with imprisonment for exposing the state.
Which I think, Max, is Mehdi's most notable journalistic achievement. I agree with you. He doesn't do any journalism. He's a pundit and a complete opportunist. But if you look at his contribution to the field of journalism, I believe this is his most significant one. Putting out false claims that lead to a member of Congress calling for the imprisonment of an actual journalist. That's Mehdi's, so far, most notable journalistic accomplishment.
Well, I want to point to another accomplishment by Mehdi Hasan in journalism. And we've covered some of his past public speaking highlights, but he also wrote a great column back in 2000 calling for the spanking of children. And no harm in smacking. This is when Mehdi Hasan, I guess, was in kind of his like conservative phase, when he believed that people who love dogs and music are satanic, as well as homosexuals. So what first of all, what would possess you to write a column calling for hitting children? It's weird. And it turns out this column was plagiarized, according to Lee, who actually dug into Mehdi's background and found that the column, word for word, was basically based on another column from U.S. News and World Report, When to Spank.
Well,
I mean, whatever. I mean, I'm not going to go reading it. But this guy's got issues, man. And he has ethical issues as well as journalistic issues. But there's also, other ethical issues here. And they relate to Stacey Plaskett, because before she was known for screaming at journalists, threatening them with jail time, calling them a threat to those around them, she was a movie star. Well, not really a movie. It was more like a kind of a sex tape. Private video of Virgin Islands Democratic delegate posted online. And just like Anthony Weiner, she said it was hacked, that she was hacked. A private videotape of the Virgin Islands delegate to Congress, Democratic Stacey Plaskett, which showed her husband naked and wearing makeup, was posted online Wednesday. A topless selfie of Plaskett was also being circulated. She said her computer was hacked and someone copied a private family video. This is what she calls a private family video. The video shows a nude Buckney Smollett, her husband, wearing makeup as Plaskett films it, according to news reports. Plaskett is heard speaking to her husband in the recording. One of the couple's children makes an appearance in the video as well, according to the statement. A Virgin Islands news organization described it as a bizarre video. So I don't know, maybe she has some problems she needs to take care of at home before she starts jailing people who criticize the CIA. Who wound up leaking that tape, or who are the hackers? The hackers were actually her own staffers who really clearly love working for her. And they were indicted. Basically, it was like the Hunter Biden laptop, but it was the cell phone from hell. They worked for Plaskett in 2015 and 2016. And according to the Department of Justice press release, one of the staffers offered in March 2016 to take her malfunctioning iPhone to a local Apple store for service. The device contained lewd photos, which the staffer later distributed online using a fake Facebook account. So, yeah, as I said, her staff must love her as much as Matt Taibbi now does. Very pleasant people. Yeah, she's standing up for the truth. There's her photo, her like headshot of herself on Twitter before she started to kind of get national notoriety over her performance on this subcommittee, was her with a fist up and a mask on, and she replaced that with like more of a glamour photo. So anyway, best of luck to Stacey Plaskett as a Blue Anon hero, and maybe you'll replace Mehdi Hasan in the MSNBC chair, the Peacock chair, when he gets elevated to the real network.
All right, let's turn to some actual journalism. Here is the latest from the Grayzone. Here's the headline: bombshell filing, 9/11 hijackers were CIA recruits. At least 2 9/11 hijackers had been recruited into a joint CIA-Saudi intelligence operation that was covered up at the highest level, according to an explosive new court filing. This is by the Grayzone's Kit Clarenberg. So Max, talk to us about this story.
Yeah, let me pull this up because I want to refer to it. But this is something that this is an episode that I wrote about in the Management of Savagery, and we've now gained new insights and shocking new details. Actually, I wouldn't even say it's shocking. I would say our worst fears about this particular episode have been seemingly confirmed through a 2021 court filing, which was just released, which came in the form of a 21-page declaration by the lead investigator of the Office of Military Commissions, which is overseeing the cases of the 9/11 defendants. His name is Don Canestraro, and he had interviewed several FBI agents who were involved in investigating 9/11 and seeking actually to prevent the attack in the months leading up to the attack. So basically, this relates to two of the hijackers, the so-called muscle hijackers, who were charged with overwhelming one of them was a muscle hijacker, overwhelming the passengers and getting to the cockpit. The other one was a pilot. Khalid al-Midhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi. These were Saudi citizens who had attended a Al-Qaeda, they called it like a mega summit. And it was a gathering of top Al-Qaeda figures in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, back in January 2000. Now, during that summit, which again, it was a major Al-Qaeda summit. During that summit, CIA agents broke into the hotel room of al-Hazmi and al-Midhar on January 5th and January 8th and photographed their passports. They were being monitored by the CIA. The CIA knew they were there, and they knew that something was being planned, something like the Day of Planes attack, which was already within the kind of in the pipeline that was heavily monitored by US, Pakistani intelligence, all sorts of intelligence services. So al-Hazmi and al-Midhar were able to then, following this summit, from Malaysia, board a direct flight to LA International Airport, get off the flight without any screening, and then be met at the airport by Omar Bayoumi, who was posing as an employee of the Saudi Civil Aviation Authority and was in fact a Saudi intelligence officer, who then took these two characters, Al-Qaeda figures, to an apartment, paid for their lease, and then arranged for them to receive rides in taxis to flight lessons while shepherding them to and from local Saudi-sponsored mosques. This should have set off alarm bells everywhere, but the CIA refused to tell the FBI that these figures were in the country. The CIA was operating through a shady unit known as Alex Station, which had been set up in tandem with the FBI, but which operated outside the FBI's purview and was essentially a black operation charged with the ability to recruit assets. And so not only did the CIA refuse to tell the FBI about these two would-be hijackers in the US, they forbade FBI agents assigned to Alex Station from telling other FBI agents. Why would they do that? Why would they be so determined to avoid the detection of these two dangerous figures as they were being shepherded through the US by Saudi intelligence? Well, it's clear now, as was everyone suspected through Don Canestraro's filing, that they had been recruited by the CIA and were CIA assets, whether they knew it or not, and that Omar Bayoumi, the Saudi intelligence agent, was himself a CIA asset working in a US-Saudi joint intelligence operation. And this raises a lot of questions, which we'll get to, but here's the statement of an agent known simply as C3 in this filing. Said that Bayoumi's contact with the hijackers and his support thereafter was done at the behest of the CIA through the Saudi intelligence service. And the explicit purpose of Alex Station was to, quote, recruit al-Hazmi and al-Midhar via a liaison relationship. And so as Kit Clarenberg details in this excellent article, which really puts all of this into context, the FBI was not told about al-Midhar and al-Hazmi's presence in the US, or the fact that I think one of them was actually the roommate of the lead 9/11 hijacker, Mohammed Atta, at one point, which would have just wrapped up the whole operation until the operation was in its final stages and they had already gone to New York. Even at that point, it was not made a law enforcement investigation, which would have necessitated arrests. It was simply an intelligence investigation, which necessitated nothing more than surveillance. So you can just point a finger directly at Langley, at the CIA, and at Alex Station and say, you are responsible for letting 9/11 happen. That is the most conservative analysis we can put forward. But we can also raise certain questions about this.
Max, this reminds me of another episode you read about in The Management of Savagery, which is the Manchester bombing in the UK, where the MI5 had basically worked with the bomber involved and not properly alerted authorities to his presence. And that failure set and staged the events that led that bombing to happen, like the bombing at the Ariana Grande concert. Is that a fair comparison?
This happens all the time. I mean, this happens all the time when assets are recruited and then they're protected by the intelligence services. We've seen it in bombings in Germany and France too, that they often had prior contact with the intelligence services and it gets swept under the rug. In the case of Salam Abedi, who was the Manchester bomber responsible for the worst terror attack I believe in British history, just ripping to shreds close to 20 young girls at a concert. He was trained with ISIS in Syria. And before that, he worked with his father, Ramadan Abedi, who is an MI5 asset from Manchester, on the battlefield in Libya to overthrow Gaddafi. And the MI5 had been maintaining this community of Libyan expats, exiles in Manchester as one of their anti-Gaddafi cards. And then once the dirty war in Libya began, the insurgency, they just turned them loose. They all got special visas to leave, exit visas to go to Libya. And when it was all over, Salam Abedi and his father were picked up by a British Royal Navy boat in Libya and taken home. I mean, it was that clearly a British operation. And so with those tactics and the ideology that he absorbed in Syria and Libya, he then went and targeted his own neighbors, his own countrymen. So we're going to have more on the Manchester bombing at the Grayzone, but back to this story. I mean, it was all covered up at the highest level for years and years, and we're only getting these details now. And then the personnel who oversaw this operation at Alex Station were promoted, including the FBI. The FBI person who was placed inside Alex Station, who did not tell other FBI personnel about al-Midhar and al-Hazmi's presence inside the U.S., Dina Corsi, she's been promoted. I think she's like the deputy director of counterintelligence for the FBI, and she was actually in touch with Pete Strzok during the whole Operation Crossfire Hurricane episode, when this FBI unit was actually trying to stir up an investigation of Donald Trump over Russian collusion. So she's still there. Then you have, she's deputy assistant director for intelligence, if you look at her LinkedIn page. And then you have the successor of the first head of Alex Station. The first head was named Richard Blee. His successor was Alfreda Francis Bukowski, who joined the CIA's operations division and was a really influential figure in the war on terror, as Kit Clarenberg writes. And he actually oversaw the quote unquote enhanced interrogations or torture of 9/11 suspects, which influenced heavily the Senate Intelligence Committee's report. The Senate Intelligence Committee's report found that Bukowski was a key player in this torture program. And what was the point of the torture program? It was to extract confessions that would essentially back up the official narrative. Our understanding of 9/11 is heavily influenced by the confessions of suspects who were placed under heavy duress through torture overseen by Bukowski. So you understand the conflict of interest there, or the corruption there, is that Bukowski is able to cover up what Alex Station did by fueling the entire narrative by presumably forcing suspects to say what he wanted. I mean, this is just insane levels of corruption that we're talking about. And so it raises questions. I mean, I think, this piece went viral and many people want to draw the most conspiratorial conclusion possible, which is that the CIA directed the 9/11 attacks in some form. Then there's the conclusion that could be drawn that the CIA allowed the 9/11 attacks to go forward in order to create space to advance the goals of the neocons and militaristic hardliners across the Middle East, who needed what Paul Wolfowitz called months before 9/11 a catalyzing event. And then you could just simply draw the conclusion, the most conservative conclusion, which is that the CIA was so desperate to get sources inside Al-Qaeda and penetrate this organization that they were willing to overlook all of the warning signs that a massive attack was about to take place and prevent the FBI from knowing about it and then cover its own tracks. So one of those three conclusions, or all three, or some combination of them, is true.
And I wonder where this leaves the 9/11 families who have been trying to seek answers about Saudi Arabia's role in 9/11 for years. There was that release of those missing pages recently, but even those pages were still redacted. And I wonder if those redactions have to do with some of the disclosures that were made here in this court filing.
Yeah, I mean, they've been forgotten. The 9/11 families have been sort of forgotten. And under Obama, I think a law was passed to prevent them from suing the Saudi government. It was passed in the Senate. Yeah. So, yeah. And the whole 9/11 attack has been placed in the rearview mirror. I'm looking forward to the cover-up investigation of the creation of the next pandemic. I don't know when that's going to take place, but I mean, we're just so deluged in psyops that this has just been swept under the rug. But the point that I want to make, and the conclusion I want to take away, is that every step of the way from 9/11 through the entire history of Al-Qaeda, there has been the hand of the CIA directing it, influencing it, supporting it, training it, or just simply paving the pathway for Al-Qaeda to transform from this local organization that was fighting the Soviets in Afghanistan to a global organization. And so we're talking about from 1979, when Zbigniew Brzezinski laid the so-called bear trap for the Red Army in Afghanistan by working with the CIA to arm the Mujahideen, which allowed bin Laden to come in and start the Services Bureau in Peshawar and begin bringing the foreign fighters in, who then got their training and then moved abroad. From there to 9/11, which completely reshaped American politics in the worst way possible, to the Syrian dirty war, in which Al-Qaeda's rebranded new entity, I don't even know what it's called, the Salvation Front. It was called Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, but it's really Al-Qaeda in Syria. They still control the northwestern province of Idlib. That was a complete NATO operation. So that's the conclusion that I want to draw. That's what the management of savagery is about. And we're still getting the details to fill in these disturbing outlines.
Well, staying on the topic of the CIA, now we have a new Democratic candidate in the presidential race, and that's Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And he kicked off his campaign with a speech calling out the CIA and the U.S. national security state. Yeah, I mean, it was a long stem winder of a speech. And we'll talk about the meaning of RFK's candidacy, or how I see it, in a minute. But one thing that's important to note
before we get into this is that if you look at the way that RFK is being described in mainstream media, they always call him an anti-vaccine activist. And in his speech, he spent much more time talking about the war state and what he is going to do about it and how he will foster peace and peaceful international relations than he did about vaccines. In fact, as our colleague Jeremy Lafredo pointed out, he only said the word vaccine once. He spent much more time on the harm of lockdowns and what it did to vulnerable communities in the US, poor communities, as well as the economy itself in driving inflation. But I clipped out much of his comments on the war state, and it was stirring, honestly. I have not heard a Democratic candidate talk like this in my entire lifetime. So let's hear what he had to say about the CIA specifically. I mean, there were long comments about the Ukraine proxy war, and I'll summarize some of them. But this is, stuff we say on the Grayzone all the time.
And my uncle came into office 2 months later. He was fighting his intelligence apparatus, his military, because they wanted to invade. They wanted to do the Bay of Pigs. He was totally against it, and he let them roll over him. And in the middle of the Bay of Pigs, he realized they were lying to him, and he realized the function of the intelligence agencies had become to provide the military-industrial complex with a constant pipeline of war. And he came out during the middle of the night during the Bay of Pigs catastrophe, and he said, I want to take the CIA. Alan Dulles had lied to him, Charles Cabell, Richard Bissell, Louis Lemitzer, Curtis LeMay had all lied to him through their teeth. And he said, I want to take the CIA and shatter it into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds.
They're cheering for the destruction of the CIA.
And George W. Bush had the same problem. George W. Bush says the worst mistake he made as president was listening to CIA Director George Tenet tell him it was a slam dunk that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. And so the neocons and CIA got to go into Iraq and throw out and do regime change. And we got now we've spent $8 trillion. And what do we get for that $8 trillion? Nothing. Worse than nothing. Iraq is now much worse off than it was when we went in there.
Well, he goes on to describe in the same way that I did in the management of savagery, how the destruction of Iraq led to the rise of ISIS. He said, we created ISIS. RFK Jr. said, we created ISIS, and it led to a migration crisis with millions of migrants heading to Europe, which then led to Brexit. And those were the exact same conclusions I drew in the management of savagery. And RFK Jr. has hosted me on his podcast to talk about Ukraine. He's hosted Scott Ritter recently to talk about Ukraine. He even more recently hosted the Assange family, John and Gabriel Shipton, to talk about Julian Assange. This is someone who understands the war state as well as we do here at the Grayzone, though he comes at it from a slightly different angle. Aaron, I know you got to go in a half hour. You got to start the Jimmy Dore live stream.
Yeah. I just want to say quickly on this, it's interesting. So now we have two sort of dissenting Democratic candidates in the presidential primary, Marianne Williamson and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And Marianne Williamson, I have a certain admiration for her personally. I like her personally, but her views on these issues having to do with foreign policy, I find pretty abhorrent. And it's interesting to compare the reaction to her running in the race with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. I mean, she, of course, was slammed for challenging Biden, but she's, I think, getting more attention and more favorable coverage than RFK is getting. And I think that has to do with not RFK's stance on vaccines, but his stance on the national security state, where he's an actual principled critic, whereas Marianne Williamson, unfortunately, because I think it actually goes against the principles that she espouses, buys into a lot of the propaganda put out by the national security state.
Yeah. She was a huge supporter of the Ukraine proxy war, U.S. providing military aid, and even got into shouting matches with people at events supporting Julian Assange here in D.C. So, I mean, if you, I think with RFK in there, I don't know what kind of appeal Marianne Williamson can actually offer disaffected, anti-war Democrats or progressives who are just disgusted with where the Democratic Party is going. In any case, I'll let you go if you need to you need to bounce.
All right. See you soon, Max.
All right. Thanks a lot, Aaron. Good seeing you. And everyone, check out Aaron on Jimmy Dore in about a half hour. We're going to continue with some RFK highlights. Now, RFK also addressed the Ukraine proxy war, and his comments were, I would say, more measured than I would have been. He offered, first of all, praise for his son Connor, who actually fought in the International Legion, which we've written about in the Grayzone. And it's your son, so what are you gonna say? He's saying he's supportive of his son, and he was supportive of the humanitarian goals as expressed in U.S. propaganda, but that in reality, this is not a war for any humanitarian end. It is actually about slaughtering Russians and sacrificing Ukrainians in order to weaken Russia, and that it actually has no end game. It's just another permanent war.
And it's many of the same people who are around the neocons who are around.
And he's hammering the neocons. I mean, we never hear anyone hammering the neocons anymore.
I've been talking about that for a long time
on the national stage, except at least within the Democratic Party
in the Ukraine since 2014. And then President Biden's Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, validated President Biden's statement by saying that our objective in the Ukraine is to exhaust and degrade the Russian army so they're incapable of having battles anywhere else in the world. Now, and indeed, many of the steps that we've taken in the Ukraine have seemed to indicate that our interest is in prolonging the war rather than shortening it. So if those are our objectives, to have regime change and exhaust the Russians, that is completely antithetical to a humanitarian mission. If we're there for a humanitarian mission, it means to reduce bloodshed and bring an end to the war quickly. If we're there to exhaust the Russians or regime change, then doesn't it mean that the Ukraine is just a pawn in a geopolitical battle between two great superpowers, and that our strategy is to put the flower of Ukrainian youth into an abattoir of death in order to exhaust Russia? And if that's true, then we need to know about it. If it's not true, then we need a pretty good discussion with the president and the Secretary of Defense and others to tell us exactly what are we doing there. And
so to sacrifice the flower of Ukrainian youth in an abattoir of death in order to exhaust Russia, that's his perspective on the Ukraine proxy war. That's my perspective on it. This was a stirring address in which RFK, in my opinion, it was stirring, maybe because I've been so disillusioned with presidential candidates over my lifetime, where he actually linked the war state to violence and oppression at home and invoked the Riverside Baptist Church tradition of Martin Luther King breaking with the civil rights movement to condemn the Vietnam War, his own father's condemnation of the Vietnam War, and the traditions going back to the founders, John Quincy Adams, warning against seeking enemies abroad and going out in search of monsters to destroy. This is something we will never hear from a Democrat. The Democratic Party is the party of war. Donald Trump, who's the most popular figure in the Republican Party, is currently denouncing the neocons and denouncing the Ukraine proxy war. Maybe he's coming at it from a different angle than RFK, but no one else in the Democratic Party is doing this. And this really speaks to what the Democratic Party and its base have become. I know the Democratic Party's base because I live in a big blue city. I live in the nation's capital. And, you see with the gentrification that's been overwhelming this city since this regime change operation that took out Marion Barry and brought in all these sort of technocrats. Now the mayor is like a Bloomberg disciple, that the people who are moving into the city, many of them actually benefit from the war economy, the post 9/11 Afghanistan, Iraq war economy. They're contractors. They work at the, defense firms. They work at the Beltway bandits like Booz Allen Hamilton that feed off of the war state, whose budget, the real defense budget, the real military budget is like $1.3 trillion. They're intelligence agents. I actually found out that someone who had moved down the street from me was a CIA operations officer working on China. So they're also extremely liberal and extremely progressive on social issues. Then you have the old Democratic Party base, the people who might have supported John F. Kennedy, who were union workers, who lived in the Rust Belt. And what happened to them? Well, in the 1990s, when the Democratic Party made this pivot to the right, when the Democratic Leadership Conference, the DLC, started rustling up Wall Street money and replacing union money with it, then they got Bill Clinton in, who lied about what he was going to do with NAFTA. He passed NAFTA and sent all those union jobs, particularly in the Rust Belt, abroad. And those same people, if they weren't already casualties of the opioid epidemic, they gave the Democratic Party establishment the finger and voted for Donald Trump in 2016. RFK is summoning the old Democratic Party that actually used to have some anti-war wing and its old base, and bringing them together with a part of the base that I think is dormant or so disaffected that they've gone into independent politics, which is the sort of activist part of the base, the people who might have, the boomers who might have protested the Vietnam War, their children and grandchildren who are anti-war. He's summoning them. In that way, he's a true centrist candidate who has the capacity to actually challenge both Joe Biden and Donald Trump for their respective bases, and not the kind of centrist Bill Clinton candidate who represents the corporate center or the center that the elite has situated. What will they do to RFK? What will they do to someone who challenged the lockdowns, who questioned the efficacy and safety of the mRNA vaccine before it was even on the market? What would they do to someone who has hosted me on his podcast, who hosts Scott Ritter, who hosts Gabriel and John Shipton, who thinks in many ways like we do, but who also represents the legacy of Camelot? Well, we have some indication of a small indication of the kind of dirty tricks that are going to be pulled on RFK based on what took place at his announcement in Boston. And
we were spending $8 trillion bombing bridges, ports, roads, and hospitals. They were spending $8 trillion building bridges, roads, ports, and hospitals.
He's talking about China. He's talking about China's Belt and Road Initiative, and he's praising the wisdom of China's Belt and Road Initiative, and putting it forward as a model for what the United States should be doing instead of exporting weapons and death everywhere, that the US should be building infrastructure and forging ties with countries in the developing world instead of imposing its will on them.
And they are now displacing us as trade partners. Most of the African nations, Latin America, Brazil, just switched to Chinese currency away from the dollar. Saudi Arabia just switched away from the dollar. Oh, these are...
So someone pulled a fire alarm.
Okay, we're okay. I'm going to finish up. I promise. I'm going to shut up in a minute.
I think the fire alarm still keeps going.
So the Chinese. So we've now lost.
Now the fire alarm continues, so someone pulled another fire alarm.
Who?
They're calling for an evacuation plan. I actually found this kind of disturbing, knowing the history.
Okay. Nice try.
So he gets that it was a dirty trick trying to shut him down. I got to say, you know, I was disturbed by that because I thought of the images of the Ambassador Hotel and his own father standing on a podium when someone or something else sabotaged his campaign, which was aimed straight at the Vietnam War, in some ways co-opting Eugene McCarthy's campaign. Bobby Kennedy believes that Sirhan was not the actual assassin. He believes that U.S. intelligence was involved in the killing of his father and uncle, which also makes him an extreme threat to the forces that control U.S. politics and substantially the Democratic Party. I mean, this is just not someone they want out there speaking. And we all know the threat of Donald Trump is not actually what he will do. The threat is what he will say. RFK poses the same threat, except that I think he's more sincere than Trump was about ending the wars, bringing the troops home, and fostering an environment of peace where the U.S. is actually a player in a multipolar world instead of the dominant hegemon in a unipolar world, imperial world order. And that's the kind of leadership this country needs at this point. If it doesn't receive that kind of leadership, there will be a two-front war with Russia and China in the near future, in my opinion. So how is the press treating RFK? So far, it seems like they're trying to ignore him. But we also have Reuters listing him among its presidential candidates, and it lists 13 candidates, ignores Marianne Williamson, and then puts RFK's name in, Vivek Ramaswamy's in bold print. Mike Pompeo, who's announced that, God told him and his wife not to run for president, is listed as a candidate. RFK, his name is not in bold print, and here it is, anti-vaccine activist. That's his entire contribution to humanity, is anti-vaccine activist. And then it notes that he's been banned from YouTube and Instagram for spreading misinformation about vaccines and the COVID-19 pandemic. No mention of the fact that Reuters is part of the Trusted News Initiative, and Reuters fact checkers are actually involved in the censorship of dissident voices from YouTube and Instagram, or that Reuters CEO, the chief executive officer of Reuters, Jim Smith, sits on the board of Pfizer. So those are the forces that he's up against. And it'll be interesting to watch this campaign. I've been looking for some campaign that would provide an opening for independent media, alternative anti-war media to actually have more of a voice on a national level. And so I'm hoping that this could be it. I don't think Jimmy Dore is going to be running, but he's definitely thrown down the gauntlet against the Democratic Party. He ended his speech by stating that he has so many skeletons in his closet that if they could all vote, he'd be president. He said that he enjoyed he sort of alluded to various sort of personal scandals that would mar any other candidate. But he said that he's not a normal candidate. He's not Al Gore, who was raised essentially to be president ever since he was put into St. Albans Academy here in Washington, D.C. by his father, who was a veteran Tennessee senator. He's not someone who cultivated himself and lived a life so that he could go into national politics. But he said these are not normal times, and he's watching his country being destroyed in front of him. And honestly, if Donald Trump can get elected with everything in his personal record, then who really cares? So I think what's going to happen here is if RFK starts to gain traction, he's already polling at 16% support from Biden voters or former Biden voters. If he starts to gain traction and starts polling well, the Democrats will begin to deploy his family members against him, Caroline Kennedy and the other ones that it's co-opted who are involved with the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Foundation, which charges like $500,000 to attend its fundraising galas. They'll start to deploy them against him to denounce him and say that he's dangerous. And there will be the same campaign we saw with Joe Rogan, with doctors denouncing him who are mobilized by these various NGO and foundation fronts. And then will come the direct attacks from party mandarins like Hillary Clinton and Obama. I think he would hate to have to denounce a Kennedy, but we could see him at the end of this all to clear way for Joe Biden, who is currently the oldest president in US history with the best cognitive enhancement drugs, who is intending to launch his campaign for re-election, which will leave him as an 88-year-old, I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong, an 88-year-old when he leaves office, which raises serious questions about whether he'll even finish his second term. And I think the people that control Joe Biden are just enjoy so much the level of control that they have over him and his administration that they just want him in there again as a kind of weekend at Bernie's figure filled with formaldehyde, like basically in a de facto cryonics lab, being carted around to give a few token speeches with teleprompters, kept away from the press while they run the empire in one of its final phases. And I don't think that, I do think, based on my own participation in events like Defeat the Mandates or the Rage Against the War Machine, which defied the kind of left-right divide, the marketing brands of left, right, Democrat, Republican, and brought together people from diverse political backgrounds around issues. I think there's a swath of the American public that is just not going to tolerate that and is also tired of Donald Trump. So we'll be following that closely. As I said, I'm going to be in Nashville this weekend, hanging out with Jimmy Dore. I don't know, post some pictures or video to the Grayzone Instagram account. Make sure to follow us on Instagram. Aaron's co-hosting or guest hosting Jimmy Dore in about 8 minutes. So I'm going to jump off here. And thanks everyone for joining us again this week. Make sure to hit the like button. Help us game the Google, YouTube algorithm. And also, if you're in New York or LA, we're on Pacifica Radio every week. LA KPFK 90.7 on Tuesday at 5 p.m. and New York WBAI 99.5 on Sunday at 6 p.m. So check us out there, and we'll see you again next Friday. Peace.